Orders, Wire, and an Unanswered Question, 19 February, Spring 1942. Declassified War Department memos from early 1942 read like machinery warming up, phrases such as military necessity and evacuation program repeated until they sound inevitable. February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 gives the Army power to designate exclusion zones. On the West Coast, the policy becomes action. Trunks are packed fast, bank accounts frozen, cameras confiscated. The most haunting detail in the camp inventories is how ordinary they are: sewing kits, recipe books, a girl's school sweater, cataloged as if a life can be itemized. Yet in parallel, another paper stream begins: mobilization. The U.S. Army is growing at a pace that strains every office, depot, and command. In a war of global logistics, the front line is fed by typists, clerks, drivers, mechanics, and radio operators. The contradiction sharpens. The state is imprisoning a community while also building women's military auxiliaries that need capable hands. The riddle at the heart of the record emerges: how can a suspect become essential without the country admitting it was wrong? The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Politics of Uniform, May 1942 to 1943. When Congress creates the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, on May 15, 1942, it is sold as a practical fix: release men for combat by placing women in non-combat roles. But the WAC's early months reveal strategy beyond staffing. The Army is standardizing administration, forms, routes, filing systems, so it can sustain operations across oceans. In archival training circulars, efficiency is treated like a weapon. Then comes a shift. The WAAC becomes the Women's Army Corps, WAC, on July 1, 1943, granting women full military status. That legal change matters: pay, benefits, discipline, and the ability to deploy where the Army needs them. For Japanese American women, however, the uniform is not only fabric, it is an argument. In 1942-43, while families remain confined, the government's loyalty regime hardens: background checks, surveillance, and suspicion. The Army's dilemma is tactical and political. It needs skilled workers, but fears the symbolism of trusting women whose relatives may be behind barbed wire. The files show the same tension everywhere: personnel shortages written in the same ink as exclusion orders. Prove it: loyalty screens, paper barriers, and the labor logic of war. The war economy devours manpower. Shipyards, aircraft plants, and depots compete with the services for labor. Every trained worker pulled into uniform must be replaced at home. In the Army's personnel correspondence, the language becomes blunt: shortages in clerical pools, signals units, and administrative sections slow training pipelines and deployment schedules. Yet for Japanese Americans, shortage does not automatically translate to opportunity, because the gate is guarded by loyalty screenings. The government's loyalty apparatus is not only ideological, it is logistical. It creates delay, uncertainty, and deniability. A woman can be rejected without a clear explanation. The absence of explanation becomes policy. Diaries and oral histories, later collected by libraries and community archives, repeat the same sensation: applying to serve while being treated as if one must earn citizenship twice. For commanders, there is also fear of scandal. One misstep could feed West Coast political anger and undercut homefront unity. The strategy becomes incremental: allow service in carefully controlled categories, place recruits where scrutiny is easier, and keep the most sensitive work compartmentalized. The nation is fighting total war, and simultaneously fighting itself over who belongs. The shadow war for language, where women could become irreplaceable. Behind the visible mobilization runs a quieter competition: intelligence. The Pacific War is a vast problem of distance and information: intercepted messages, captured documents, interrogation reports, translation of manuals and diaries taken from battlefields. Technology matters: radio interception networks, code systems, and the laborious human work of turning Japanese text into actionable English. Even before the U.S. fully stabilizes its code-breaking and translation capacity, planners recognize a hard truth: language competence is not manufactured quickly. It has grown over years in homes and schools, in newspapers and community life, precisely the life now being dismantled by incarceration. For Japanese American women with Japanese language ability, the war creates a paradoxical opening. Skill that was previously foreign becomes militarily valuable. But the same skill triggers suspicion. Intelligence work is built on compartmentalization, need to know, layered clearances, strict supervision, so the Army can exploit linguistic talent while minimizing political risk. In effect, the U.S. begins to treat identity as equipment, useful in one context, dangerous in another. The most revealing documents are not dramatic, they are assignment lists, training syllabi, and terse evaluations. They show how a woman could be moved like a chess piece across the board of the war, valued for what she knows while never fully trusted for who she is. A uniform as evidence, motivation, family pressure, and the cost of volunteering. The most compelling testimony in the record is personal, not official. Letters preserved in family collections carry a dual tone, patriotism braided with grief. Some women enlist to open doors closed by stigma, others to steady their family's status, some because the alternative is being defined solely as a detainee's daughter or sister. The choice is never abstract. It sits beside camp postcards and relocation center addresses, beside news of brothers drafted or volunteering for segregated units, beside the knowledge that a uniform might protect one relative while leaving another still confined. Strategically, the Army benefits from volunteers who are already disciplined by crisis, people accustomed to improvising under pressure. Yet the human cost is sharp. To serve is to accept the Army's rules, including silence, compartmentalization, and obedience, while knowing the same institution is intertwined with the policy that uprooted your community. The hook that returns again and again in interviews is this: how do you salute a flag while your mother sleeps behind guard towers? And yet many did, because they believed service could be proof, leverage, or simply a way to reclaim agency. In the wartime archive, heroism is not always a battlefield charge. Sometimes it is a signature on an enlistment form written under suspicion. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. Narrow Doors, Recruitment, Geography, and the Problem of Where You're From, 1943 to 1944. In the recruiting correspondence for the WAC after July 1, 1943, the Army's need is clear: clerks, stenographers, drivers, medical aides, telephone operators, roles that keep an expanding force coherent. But the same files reveal a second map overlaid on the United States, a political geography of suspicion. West Coast origins could trigger extra scrutiny, Japanese ancestry alone could stall an application. The mechanics are mundane: fingerprints, interviews, reference letters, yet the effect is strategic. Delays slow accession pipelines, inconsistent decisions create rumor, which discourages applicants and wastes manpower. Some Japanese American women find the door slightly wider in places away from the coastal pressure cooker, where commanders are focused on throughput rather than headlines. Others are routed toward safe assignments, jobs essential but deliberately distant from the most sensitive desks. The Army is practicing a form of personnel compartmentalization, not just of information, but of identity. In internal notes, officers weigh optics. Admitting these women too publicly might anger exclusion advocates; rejecting them outright wastes talent. The compromise is quiet acceptance, careful placement, and a preference for tasks that can be framed as administrative rather than political. The war demands bodies; politics dictates where those bodies may stand. Basic training: how the Army manufactured cohesion, and how prejudice leaked in 1943 to 1944. Training schedules preserved in Army circulars show the WAC built like any other military system: drill, regulations, physical conditioning, inspections, and the relentless grammar of military time. The tactical purpose is not combat skill but dependability, turning civilians into standardized components of an enormous logistical machine. A WAC company that can type, file, route messages, and follow orders without improvising disaster becomes a force multiplier for every headquarters it supports. For Japanese American women, basic training carries an extra layer. Every mistake risks becoming evidence in someone else's argument about loyalty. Oral histories often describe the same balancing act: blend in, excel, don't complain. Some women encounter open hostility, others meet instructors who judge performance and nothing else. The Army itself is not a single mind. It is a hierarchy of local commanders, each with discretion, each with prejudices or professionalism. From the archivist's view, the pattern is revealing. Prejudice rarely appears in formal policy language, but it shows up in annotations: questionable, needs further check, watch. Against that, the women build their own tactics: competence as armor, discipline as a shield, friendships as mutual protection. The Army trains cohesion, the women often have to create it. Where the war needed them, offices, depots, hospitals, and the hidden front of paper, 1943 to 1945. Once assigned, many WACs entered the engine rooms of the war, personnel centers processing transfers, depots tracking spare parts, hospitals managing records and supplies, communications hubs routing orders and reports. In a conflict defined by oceans, paper becomes a weapon: misfile a shipment and a unit trains without ammunition, misroute a telegram and a convoy sails blind. The Army's logistical doctrine depended on redundancy and standardization, but it also depended on people who could keep calm amid volume. Japanese American women's service often unfolded here, in fluorescent-lit rooms where the soundtrack was typewriter keys and the stakes were measured in days saved. Equipment mattered: switchboards, teletype machines, filing systems, standardized forms that allowed commands across continents to speak the same administrative language. This is the war beneath the war. It rarely appears in headlines, yet it shapes tempo: how fast divisions move, how quickly replacements arrive, how efficiently casualties are recorded and supplies replenished. The irony is sharp: a woman might spend 8 hours a day helping the U.S. Army move smoothly, then return to a world where her family's freedom is still conditional. The battlefield is not always mud and smoke. Sometimes it is an inbox. Intelligence by another name, translation, intercepts, and the value of a quiet skill, 1943 to 1945. The Pacific War produced a river of captured material: maps, diaries, unit orders, technical manuals, and a steady churn of radio traffic. Turning that into usable intelligence required both technology and labor. Radio interception could seize signals, but translation and interpretation were human tasks, vulnerable to fatigue and error. In declassified post-war summaries, the most successful intelligence organizations are praised not only for brilliance but for throughput: how quickly they could convert raw Japanese into English that commanders could act upon. This is where Japanese American language ability became strategically precious. Yet the work demanded secrecy, clearances, restricted rooms, controlled circulation of documents. The Army and Allied agencies used compartmentalization to manage risk, limit who knows what, and keep linguists focused on text rather than policy. For women, the opportunities were uneven and often quiet, but the principle is consistent: language is a force multiplier. A translated order can reveal a unit's location, a captured notebook can expose supply shortages, a technical manual can identify vulnerabilities in equipment. In a war where submarines stalked sea lanes and islands were taken at enormous cost, information could save ships and lives. The shadow war ran on paper, ink, and the people who could read what others could not. The Homefront contradiction: service while camps remained, 1944. By 1944, the contradiction is no longer theoretical. The Army is deploying women in growing numbers, the WAC is normalized as part of the force structure. Meanwhile, incarceration continues, reshaped but not erased, families still in War Relocation Authority centers, lives still paused behind fences. Political pressure shifts slowly as the war evolves, the need for unity competes with entrenched racism. The evidence of Japanese American service complicates propaganda that painted an entire population as suspect. The women serving in uniform become living counter-documents. Their very presence in Army files, pay records, duty rosters, performance evaluations, undercuts the logic of collective guilt. Yet that does not automatically change policy. Governments rarely confess error mid-war. Instead, they adjust at the edges, seeking outcomes without admissions. From a strategic standpoint, this is a classic wartime calculation: manage domestic cohesion, feed the manpower pipeline, and avoid political fracture. From a human standpoint, it is exhausting. Letters from this period often carry two wars at once, one against Axis powers overseas, another against insinuation at home. The riddle posed at the start tightens: what does loyalty mean when it is demanded as payment for rights already owed? The Army's calculus, where women could be seen, and where they could not, late 1944, early 1945. In late 1944, the personnel machinery is running at full heat. Unit histories and administrative rosters show WAC detachments embedded across commands, but placement is never random. Commanders balance three pressures: operational need, security doctrine, and public optics. Japanese American women, especially those with language skills, could be invaluable, yet the Army also feared the political blowback of assigning them to roles that might be described as sensitive. The result was a quiet sorting system: administrative talent sent to large headquarters that needed sheer volume handled, language talent sometimes used under layers of supervision and restricted access. This is strategy applied to people. The same way the Army protected radar sets and cryptographic procedures, it tried to protect the legitimacy of its own personnel decisions. In the archival trail, this appears as negative space, missing specifics, generalized job titles, deliberate blandness in descriptions. But the pattern is legible: intelligence work thrives on anonymity, and for Japanese American women anonymity also reduced controversy. Their labor could be counted without being advertised. It's an uncomfortable truth of wartime bureaucracy: a person can become indispensable and still be treated as a risk to be managed. Machinery and method, the technology of communications work, 1943 to 1945. Signals and administrative technology shaped what WACs actually did day to day. The War Office ran on telephones, switchboards, teletype, carbon copies, mimeographs, and standardized form systems that allowed a message to be traced from a field command to a depot and back again. These tools were not glamorous, but they determined speed, and speed in modern war meant survival. A teletype line that stayed reliable under load could move convoy orders, casualty lists, and supply requests faster than any courier. The Army's system depended on disciplined procedure, message precedence, routing codes, logging, authentication practices. Errors could be catastrophic: sending the wrong movement order, misrouting medical supplies, or leaking information through careless handling. For Japanese American women, technical competence also functioned as social proof. A well-run switchboard or flawlessly processed packet of orders made it harder for skeptics to argue they were untrustworthy. The equipment itself becomes part of the story's tension. Machines amplify humans, but they also expose them. The operator is recorded by logs, the clerk by signatures, the translator by marginal notes. In a bureaucracy, your fingerprints are often literal: on paper, on forms, on the war's operational bloodstream. The battle inside the war, morale, rumor, and the weight of stereotype, 1944 to 1945. Not every fight in wartime is visible on maps. In memoirs and later interviews, Japanese American servicewomen describe a subtler front: insinuations, questions asked with a smile, moments where a joke carried a blade. A rumor can function like enemy action: it disrupts cohesion, erodes trust, and forces people into defensive postures. The Army understood morale as an element of combat power, yet it often treated prejudice as a private matter rather than a strategic liability. That mismatch mattered. Units with internal friction waste time, avoid cooperation, and make mistakes. The women's tactics for survival were practical: over-prepare, anticipate inspections, keep immaculate records, build alliances with fair-minded supervisors, and choose silence when confrontation would only harden suspicion. Some found genuine camaraderie, others found that acceptance arrived only after excellence became undeniable. From an archival standpoint, the most telling artifacts are small: a performance rating that reads exceptional without elaboration, a promotion that arrives late, a transfer justified in vague terms. The paper trail shows both achievement and the constant need to earn normal treatment. Their service becomes, in effect, a continuous audit. Shifting ground, policy eases, but the past does not disappear. 1944 to 1945. As the war nears its end, the U.S. government begins to loosen some restrictions and prepare for post-war realities. The logic is partly moral, partly practical. The indefinite incarceration of an entire community is becoming harder to justify in a nation claiming to fight for freedom. Yet bureaucracies rarely reverse course cleanly. They move in steps, with qualifications and exceptions, leaving many families in limbo. For service women, this produced a strange temporal split. In uniform, they inhabited a forward-moving institution that measured time in operations and demobilization plans. At home, their communities still lived in the long aftermath of 1942, lost property, disrupted education, broken businesses. Economic context matters here. Wartime inflation, labor demand, and housing shortages made returning difficult even when policy began to shift. The war economy had created opportunity for many Americans, but for Japanese American families it had also created a gap, years without the ability to accumulate, invest, or even choose where to live. The women's paychecks and benefits could help, but could not restore what had been taken. The Army could issue a uniform quickly, it could not restore a stolen childhood. Victory's paperwork, 1945, and the uneven meaning of home, spring, late 1945. In 1945, the war's ending arrives in stages, Europe in May, the Pacific after August. Demobilization brings its own avalanche of documents, discharge papers, travel authorizations, medical exams, job placement forms. For many WACs, the end of service meant a return to ordinary life. For Japanese American women, ordinary was often unavailable. The archive of 1945 is crowded with beginnings that don't feel like beginnings, families released from camps into cities that may not want them, property disputes, searches for housing, attempts to re-enroll in schools, job interviews shadowed by the same old question, where are you really from? Their military service could open doors, but it could also provoke resentment. The strategic value of their work had been real, measurable in the smooth functioning of commands and the speed of information. Yet victory did not automatically confer justice. What remains most cinematic in the record is the contrast, a crisp discharge stamp beside a letter asking relatives where they will live now, a photograph in uniform beside a camp address that still exists on the same page. The war ended. The contradiction did not. Don't talk about it, secrecy, silence, and the intelligence aftertaste, 1945, late 1940s. When the shooting stopped, the habits of secrecy did not. Intelligence work, translation, intercepted material handling, report drafting, came wrapped in oaths and a culture of non-disclosure that followed veterans into civilian life. In the archival record, this produces a peculiar distortion. Service that was crucial is often documented only in fragments, with job titles that read deliberately generic. For Japanese American women, that official vagueness compounded an older pressure to stay quiet and avoid attracting scrutiny. Many returned to communities rebuilding from dispossession. Speaking too loudly about secret work could invite suspicion rather than praise. Strategically, the U.S. military was already looking ahead, occupation duties, emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union, and the permanent expansion of security institutions. The techniques refined during wartime, compartmentalization, clearance vetting, document control, did not vanish, they hardened into routine. For the women who had helped run the war's paper arteries, the post-war world offered a choice between testimony and privacy. Silence often won, not because their stories lacked drama, but because the costs of telling were real. The riddle deepens. A democracy celebrated victory publicly while burying some of the people who made that victory function. Justice without confession, the slow turn toward acknowledgement, 1945-1950s. The end of incarceration did not mean the end of consequences. Families faced economic ruin, farms sold under pressure, shops looted or lost, professional careers derailed. The national narrative moved on quickly, parades, rationing lifted, new anxieties. In this environment, Japanese American women veterans occupied an uneasy symbolic space. Their uniforms offered undeniable evidence that collective suspicion had been wrong in practice, yet the state rarely admitted it had been wrong in principle. Early redress efforts and claims processes existed, but they were limited and slow, and they could not reconstruct what had been destroyed. From a policy angle, this is a classic post-crisis maneuver, offer partial remedies that reduce political pressure without reopening foundational decisions. From a human angle, it felt like being asked to accept a receipt instead of restoration. The women's biographies show how service functioned as a lever, education opportunities, job access, and a claim to belonging, while also revealing how shallow that leverage could be in the face of widespread discrimination. Their lives demonstrate a harsh logistical truth: wartime bureaucracy can move armies with precision, but it struggles to repair the people it has damaged. The war's gender ledger, what the WAC changed, and what it didn't, 1942, post-war. The WAC was both revolutionary and constrained. It placed women in uniform at scale and proved, in measurable outputs, that female labor could sustain military operations. Yet it also formalized a boundary: women were essential, but often framed as support rather than decision-makers. For Japanese American women, that boundary intersected with race in ways that doubled the burden. Their achievements were frequently registered as efficient, reliable, quiet, praise that simultaneously minimized the adversity behind the performance. In the records of postings and evaluations, you can see how the Army valued them instrumentally, as a resource to be deployed, not a story to be celebrated. Equipment and procedure mattered here because they offered a path to authority that did not require permission from prejudice. If you mastered the switchboard, the teletype protocol, the filing system, you became hard to replace. That is a tactical reality. Competence creates dependency. But the post-war rollback in women's military roles shows the limits of wartime necessity as a driver of lasting equality. The WAC opened doors, peace tried to close them. The women's service sits in that hinge moment, proving capability under pressure while being asked, afterward, to step back into smaller narratives. What the archive reveals by accident: photos, rosters, and the evidence of presence. Some truths survive not because institutions preserve them carefully, but because bureaucracy cannot function without leaving tracks. A roster lists names. A payroll ledger confirms months of duty. A photograph captures a row of women in uniform, their posture trained, their expressions unreadable to outsiders. For historians, these artifacts are not trivial. They are proof of presence, proof of participation, proof against erasure. And presence matters because wartime America created competing realities: official suspicion on one hand, official dependence on the other. The most revealing contrasts come when you place documents side by side: an exclusion policy directive and, nearby, a personnel shortage report, a camp address and a military assignment order, a public speech about loyalty and a private memo about needing more trained workers. That juxtaposition is where analysis becomes unavoidable. The U.S. fought the Axis with a rhetoric of freedom, yet domestically it accepted mass removal and confinement. Japanese American women in the WAC stand at the intersection of those contradictions. Their files show not only what they did, but what the nation required them to represent: reassurance, proof, and sometimes convenient silence. The riddle answered: how a suspect became essential without the nation admitting why. The riddle in the title, What Happens When a Suspect Volunteers, is answered not in a single heroic moment, but in the slow accumulation of verified facts. In 1942, the state built exclusion zones and camps under the claim of military necessity. In 1943, it expanded the WAC to meet the necessity of a global war machine. By 1944-45, it relied on women's labor to keep headquarters functioning, communications flowing, records accurate, and intelligence processed at speed. Japanese American women who served did so inside a system that doubted them, and they did it with tools, typewriters, switchboards, teletype logs, translation sheets, that rarely appear in triumphal war stories. Their contribution was strategic. They increased tempo, reduced friction, and improved the Army's ability to move men and material across continents. The nation did not need to confess error to exploit competence, it only needed to file competence under useful. Yet the archive, read honestly, refuses that convenience. It shows that loyalty was never the real scarcity, fairness was. And the most enduring legacy of these women may be precisely that they left behind a paper trail strong enough to outlive the prejudices that tried to keep them invisible.